You could make an argument for that being the N64 because of the fact that, and I actually do have a 64 controller, I just didn't bring it with me, but you know, the 64 controller, you grabbed in the middle if you wanted to use the analog stick, and then you grabbed on the side if you wanted to use the D-pad. Now, you know, in all reality, what that ended up doing was kind of making most of the controller useless most of the time, because you'd be using an either-or mentality. And I think in many cases that's probably exactly where we don't want to be from a perspective of, you know, a controller. You don't want to have a controller that you never use part of it. It just doesn't make much sense, and it takes up unwanted real estate, and we all know how those freaking N64 controllers stored. They didn't store well at all whatsoever. But I think the reason why I say that, the 360 controller takes the D-pad and really throws it down over here where the DualShock puts the analog stick, and then just throws the analog stick right up here. Simple and easy, right? Makes total sense. Same thing happened on the original Xbox controllers. I always call it the Xbox One. What the hell do you call it now? Anyway, the original Xbox had the same thing going on. Now, I don't think the original Xbox is going to get nominated for any of the Best Controller awards. Most probably because of the Duke. And I didn't bring my Duke with me. I have it in the other room, but I could show you the Duke. The Duke would take up the entire screen. You'd never see anything. But anyway, so the Duke had the same thing going, but it was so huge, it was clunky, and it was difficult to control. I found it to be really, really tough. And I have pretty big hands, so you know what they say about gamers with big hands, right? That they play with big controllers. The point is, this is, I think, as Smokepan said, the best implementation of the analog stick. Clearly exactly the same as the Super Nintendo design here. We've got the bumpers, which is clearly the same as the Super Nintendo, with the triggers, which I think tend to be actually probably one of my favorite parts of the Xbox 360 controller. I think it does triggers better than anybody else does. The triggers are real triggers. They have a lot of give. There's, you know, you don't have to you have to crank them every single time to get any kind of awareness. You can tap them easy enough if you need to do that. It just makes sense to me that that's how, you know, in a video game you're going to be firing, or you're going to be letting loose with a grenade, or those kinds of things. It just makes sense. And I think ergonomically speaking, it just kind of does it all, right? It's much more ergonomic than an SNES controller, but you can see, you know, the SNES controller kind of starts, you know, with the idea of the kind of, you know, dropping out, making this area bigger, right? These two areas kind of bigger, and then it kind of drops out. 360 controller takes that to the next level. Yeah, I know they need to hide the motors inside of it and whatever, but I just think it does that perfectly. And we all know the weakness, right? The weakness of the D-pad. But I think that's the whole part of the 360 controller, is that the D-pad is pretty worthless, so why even put it on there? I think they could have gone without that D-pad, and I'd have been perfectly fine with it. So they didn't leave behind the old controllers and the D-pad world that we lived in completely. They just threw it out mostly. Cool. Youngblood drew attention to the fact that if you have smaller hands, then you're probably going to prefer this controller right here, which is an original DualShock controller for the PS1, which is what I have in front of me now. Now, as you can see, even just probably a little bit right off the bat, one of the analog sticks that you know I use the most kind of hangs off now. It doesn't completely center up. You know, you can shake it and kind of see it move around a little bit. But let's talk about this thing a little bit. I think people with smaller hands probably do find this controller a lot easier to use. Like, my hands are completely around this controller right now. And if you compare that to a 360 controller right now, where I can't grab a hold of that thing at all in the same way. It's kind of wider, it's kind of more spaced out. The DualShock was always my favorite back in the day. I thought it was a great implementation. I like that there are bumpers. I've never liked that there were two sets of bumpers, though. I thought that was a kind of a design flaw. I much prefer the triggers of the 360 there, but I thought that was a cool, you know, an interesting idea that you could do that. You could foreseeably, you know, do like cool things like Metal Gear Solid and things like that, where you could tap both buttons and pull your hands off the controller, which is cool. The D-pad on the DualShock, for my money, is probably the best D-pad, if not the best D-pad ever, outside of the Super Nintendo. The D-pad implementation here is just great. I like having the buttons separated. I like it being part of the same, still the same part of the same D-pad, but it just feels so much better in your hands. It just reacts better. It feels better. And for my money, you could get better, more accurate button presses from this D-pad on the DualShock controller than you could out of any other D-pad ever made. It just does everything right in that regard. But look again, right? We're in the exact same place we were before with the Super Nintendo button implementation. Hasn't changed, won't change. The grouping's a little bit different, obviously, because Super Nintendo circled them horizontally. But the square, circle, triangle, X configuration is still around today. Will be around forever, and I think that's a cool way to do it. There's no Microsoft went A, B, X, Y the same way that that Super Nintendo did. Anyway, and of course, it's got the place for the rumble motors and things like that. The analog sticks on the original DualShock for sure, but as we got into DualShock 2 and DualShock 3, less so, felt like they just weren't nearly as robust for my money as the ones on the Microsoft controller. We all know the problem with the analog stick on the N64. That thing was impossible to work with, and I think that thing would have been great with you throw a 360 kind of a mechanism on there, and it would just be awesome. Anyway, just my opinion. Dubious Gaming talked about the ergonomics and the build quality of the 360 controller as being one of the reasons why he thinks it's the best. Ergonomics are a huge factor. I'll show you in a minute when I get to my nomination, as it were. How the philosophy of things kind of changed. You went from that kind of block for the NES to having more of a kind of parallel thought. Think about the Duke again for the Xbox. Your hands are parallel. They're very far apart because the damn thing is so huge, like a Wii U controller, for example. But your hands are very apart, but they're kind of parallel, right? It's still square. It's just parallel. Slowly, companies kind of decided that your hands didn't need to be parallel. They needed to be kind of intersecting and closer together. That's what I think the DualShock does very well, but really gets done very well on the 360 controller, more than any controller before. You can see my hands are not parallel. They're actually running up against each other right at the top. And so the capability, ergonomically speaking, is so much better. You don't get hand cramps. You don't feel awkward with your wrist. I mean, I'm not saying those things don't happen. They still do. But it just feels so much more comfortable. I think one of the reasons why you don't hear people talk anymore about getting Nintenditis, and there's not all that garbage in the media about how it's ruining our hands and blah, 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 is because ergonomically speaking, things are just so much better now than they ever were before. I think the 360 is the first real controller that is ergonomically almost perfect. It just gets the job done in every way possible. You might disagree about where the buttons are arranged and how they should move and where they should be. I think that's valid criticism. I just think in your hands, for my money, it just doesn't seem like there's a much better controller than the 360 controller. It's just totally perfect, makes total sense. No matter where you put it, it feels good. And let's see, where does that leave me? Yes, with, what is this, Siska 83? Why not include PC controls as a part of our conversation? Well, it's a good point. Using a keyboard and a mouse is undeniably probably the most utilized, well, I don't want to say the most, it's up there as the most utilized control mechanism for games in history, right? And I think most people would say, at least people that are pretty hardcore would say it's still the best. And I think that makes a lot of sense. You get a lot of accuracy with a mouse, especially when you kind of learn that system, of going through, for example, with a traditional mouse system. The capabilities are fairly easy. It fits in your hand really well. It's easy to kind of move around, and you kind of get the right perspective, as it were, with a mouse and keyboard. You feel kind of like you're there. you're using both of your hands in tandem. Even if you're moving with this one, it's less kind of more, you know, blistered thumbs kind of a feel, right? I like that better. For first-person shooter, for my money, there is nothing better than a keyboard and a mouse, but I still buy all my first-person shooters for the controllers. I'm talking about genres, which is what many of you did. I think there's a genre conversation. This gets back to Mr. K's comment. There's a genre conversation here. If we're talking about platformers, for my money, there is nothing in the world better than a controller. Platformers just make sense with controllers. If you're talking to me about RTS, you know, given that nothing really has changed in control mechanisms for a long, long time, you know, voice, touch, you know, controlling kind of in the air with movement, put those aside for a second. RTS makes no sense to me on a controller. It just doesn't work well. You know, obviously we talked about shooters. You know, what else? RPGs. RPGs work really, really well in controllers. RPGs do not seem to me, do not seem to work at all with me with mouse and keyboard. I don't know why, but that just seems to be the way that it is. Racing games. Racing games for me are either a controller based or they are peripheral based with a wheel, which I used to have. I remember getting Gran Turismo 2 and a wheel for my PlayStation one Christmas, and I just thought it was the greatest thing ever. One of my ongoing projects is to build an actual racing rig for the Xbox. Maybe I'll make it for the Xbox One now, I don't know. Or for PS4 or for whatever I end up buying, because the jury is still out. The point is, you know, the thought is that I would rather have a driving mechanism for racing games. That being said, whenever I play Mario Kart on the Wii, I always play with the nunchuck alongside the Wiimote. And that's because, for me, that just makes the most sense. I can drive with my little nunchuck, and I can do flips and pull all the buttons with this hand. And it just makes logical sense to me. I like that control. I think it works. Maybe that's because the turning and everything on the Wii U isn't so wonderful, or on the Wii isn't so wonderful. I'd like to see what can happen with the Wii U. So you guys see what I'm saying. I don't have to go through every single freaking genre. The point is, I think there could be a best controller for every single genre. Maybe that's another good question. And there were several of you that brought up questions that kind of shot off from this conversation. Trust me, I wrote them all down. I have the lists. Whenever you guys nominate any kind of questions for me, I write them down and use them in future Ringers. I love asking user-submitted questions as a part of the Weekly Ringer. Okay, I'm going to talk now about my favorite control, or one of my favorite controllers. And that is this puppy right here. So this is a Dreamcast controller, and I think this follows along with the conversation. You see the memory pack right here, right? This follows along with several, this is a key evolution in my mind from several things that go on with the history of controllers. First of all, buttons. Same as the Super Nintendo, always have been, always will be. It makes total sense. They seem a little smaller, a little more candy-like, but you know, solid, easy to use, simple, right? No select button, just a start button. The D-pad on this is deceptive. It looks kind of difficult to use, and it looks sharp and edgy, but I actually found the D-pad on this to be very responsive. It's very cushy. You can notice I don't know if you can hear that at all, but there's not much to it, right? It's very responsive, it's very quiet, and it takes a ton of force. So I actually like that implementation. But the control of the analog stick, this is the first big evolution that I saw in the Dreamcast that I thought was so well implemented. This thing just gets it. This is the best I've seen outside of a 360, is the analog control on a DC. Now, here's what I was going to talk about. You see here, when I put my hands on this, how my hands are completely parallel. Maybe even bending out a little bit. Maybe bending out and pointed out at the top. That, to me, is kind of an ugly ergonomic situation. You know, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But the controller feels really good in my hands. It's very easy to kind of manipulate all the buttons. Everything is within a push, no problem. The triggers on the Dreamcast are really, really good. And the thing